of decency was often focused on young women. And of course, the heroine of this film will be a young woman of Irish American descent. We're introduced to her family. Her uncle. Notice the sewing machine in the background, and then we're going to get her mother, played by Alice Nolan, who often played mothers. And she's an Irish or Irish American washerwoman. And finally, the heroine, Kitty McGuire, who is the wage earner in the family. And this is her introduction, which I think is rather daring for a film star like Mae Murray, who was known for her beauty. She's preparing to go to work. And she's in a hurry. Mae Murray was sometimes criticized for being too energetic, always moving, kind of hyperkinetic. But she's obviously trying to give a kind of Irish spirit to her heroine. And in this moment with her Uncle Barney, there's also the suggestion that she wants something better in life. Not only that she's angry with her uncle for being such a lazeabout. Good parlor furniture. So she's going to appreciate the finer things in life we're going to see, quite easily actually. I like the touch of the garbage can in the hallway. And off she goes. In the meantime, through cross-cutting, we learn about her father, Pat McGuire, played by another very experienced supporting cast member. Mae Murray's films in this era at Universal always had really good supporting casts that were commented on often in film reviews. At least one reviewer of this film took offense at the way this family was established, with men being supported by women. One female reviewer in Billboard said, quote, "There is nothing very engaging in watching two lazy, maudlin old Irishmen shoveling food down their throats." We're going to see that scene later. Uncle Barney is always hungry. "Especially when it is earned by a frail woman at the washtub and a spunky young girl driven to a questionable resort to obtain employment." End quote. Now we see Kitty in her current job, which is as a coat check girl. Again, she already appreciates the possibilities of having finer things. In this case, a lovely coat. Is that ermine? I don't know. Yeah, poor little heads of the creatures are at the bottom. In any case, cross-cutting back to Barney. At least he's literate, sort of. But he's not putting that to any use, is he? So Kitty lives in an urban tenement and is attached to a poor family of immigrants. In Mae Murray's case, her background was rather similar, except for the fact that her family was of German origin. Mae Murray started as a dancer, and I'll go more into that later on. So she was not a trained actress when she made her film debut in 1916, actually at famous Players Lasky. And like the heroine of this film, she was raised in financially and emotionally difficult circumstances. This particular flashback scene of when she's dancing in the street, taking her mother's washing, I guess, to the clients, and dancing accompanied by the organ grinder, was actually referenced by Mae Murray the star in an article in a fan magazine in 1920, the year after The Delicious Little Devil was released, as being something that actually happened in her own life. This was characteristic of her in blending fantasy, film, fabrication. It was classic Mae Murray. And also in the fact that in her story in the fan magazine, her origins were elevated. She was actually wandering into a neighborhood, a low-class neighborhood that wasn't characteristic of where she lived, presumably in Portsmouth, Virginia, where she always claimed falsely that she was born and raised in a genteel family, that she may have even come out as a debutante. So now Kitty's intense concentration in dancing is interrupted by real life and a very angry manager. I like the way this scene is set up by director Robert Z. Leonard. And again, I think there's a little bit of daring to it in this full shot of Kitty making her way back up to the counter. All her energy drained now. Though she still has a little bit of energy left to keep her gum chewing going. Dejected, rejected, and in a pickle. It's a good scene. Cross-cutting characterizes this film in its first 15 minutes, that's for sure. So here we're back at the family apartment. Alice Nolan, who plays Kitty's mother, was only about 5.5 years older than Mae Murray, who plays her daughter. Mae Murray was born in 1885, so when she played Kitty McGuire, she was 34 years old. And you can't really blame her for shaving years off her age throughout her career, because she was competing against much younger women, both when she was a dancer and also when she was a star. And she looked young, and she was initially cast at Famous Players Lasky in several roles in which she plays a kind of waif, almost a Mary Pickford type, a kind of wistful waif, fragile, even if spunky. And this was a youth culture, right? It was the jazz age, which F. Scott Fitzgerald officially declared to be so in 1919. Fan magazines regularly represented to the public her tale that she was working on Broadway as a chorus girl when she was 13 or 14 years of age, which of course was not true. Some say she started her dance career in Chicago, but that seems a little bit unlikely. I mean, she was a New Yorker, and she was featured finally after working in various musical comedies as a chorus girl and in shows and doing also some exhibition dancing. She finally got a job in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1908. And she had broken through on Broadway by filling in for the very famous dancer Irene Castle in the Irving Berlin show About Town. So in the Follies of 1908, she was a chorus girl, and she climbed up the ranks to a specialty act and then being a featured star. One of her most famous acts from the Follies exploited her resemblance to Mary Pickford, and this was in 1915. And this act was called Mary, M-E-R-R-Y, Pickham, which showed a film of Murray to the audience, and then also had her running around the auditorium being chased by a kind of villainous character, and she supposedly was dressed in an antebellum outfit. The Delicious Little Devil operates on this cultural preoccupation with the modern woman, who was often identified with the working woman and with youthful women, and on this cultural preoccupation of the good bad woman, especially because it was seen that women were more in the public eye and were interested in consumerism and were being, we might say, spectacularized by their fashion that was getting briefer and briefer. Florence Ziegfeld's shows lifted the showgirl in the public eye. We're going to talk a little bit later about the differences between different groups of the showgirls in his follies. But he was celebrating the beauty of the American woman. Nevertheless, his shows were controversial. I mean, they were girl shows. And they drew a lot of men in the audience. And he was very good at introducing costumes which were actually highly revealing, but somehow managed to seem respectable. He catered to an upper-class audience and middle-class audiences in the consumption of his creation of a review with enhanced, even lavish production values that he could present and publicize as the celebration of a certain kind of beauty, which was an American beauty, but of course, white beauty. Mae Murray was not the only film star who came out of this background. For those of you who've been waiting for Valentino to show up, it'll be just a minute now that we've introduced the man who plays his father, Edward Jobson. And here we have Valentino, finally, almost 15 minutes into this film. Yes, he's radically miscast, but he was very grateful, no doubt, to get cast in this film. Valentino actually knew Mae Murray from the New York dance scene. There's probably little doubt that she had some role in getting him cast as Jimmy Calhoun, which is obviously an incredible miscasting, that he's supposed to play an Irish American, and his fine olive complexion is obscured in this era of orthochromatic film, which didn't register colors accurately. The makeup is often unflattering, but this is an extreme example of that. So now we have yet another change of scenery and are introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Musk. The intertitle tells us all. The Peachtree Inn has fallen on hard times. Let me introduce these actors to you. Martha Maddox actually was also in another Mae Murray film in which she played her strict aunt, and that was in a film called The Scarlet Shadow of the year before, of 1918. And her most famous role would be in the Paul Lenny directed film The Cat and the Canary. Burt Woodruff lasted forever in the movies. His career started around 1916 and it ended in 1931. Among his films was the 1925 Native American-centered Western, The Vanishing American, with Richard Dix. He's in a lot of films. He's going to have some great comic moments later on. And we have William Mong, who you may have never heard of, but boy, he is literally in dozens and dozens of movies. He first started out at Sea League Studios as a director and a writer, but he switched to film acting in the mid-teens, and boy did he stay busy. In 1916, he was in 18 different films, and he certainly kept busy up until 1938 when he became ill, and that was the year of his last film, and he died in 1940. So here we are, back at the McGuire household, where things remain depressingly the same. Of course, not for Uncle Barney and Father Patrick, This is a very cute scene, I think, with Ivor McFadden. Her attitude is just so blasé. It's like, all right, you took me for a ride. I've done my duty. Goodbye. She's dealing with the prospect of unemployment. But she has her newspapers to look for a job. Of course, it's going to be doubly depressing to go inside and realize that her male family members are going to be of no help in this job search, nor will they be interested in seeking out a job themselves. Again, I think Mae Murray plays this scene just right. Critics ran hot and cold with her, in the sense that they would say, oh, she's great in this film, but then another film she's not so good in. That they basically thought that she ran hot and cold in terms of her display of understanding of the characters and being able to convey their motives and their feelings, etc. Now, this is an interesting little moment because it's on which the whole plot hinges, that she's going to be passing for a woman for Gloria Dumonet, for the notorious dancer. And we might ask ourselves, how come no one seems to know what Gloria looks like? Well, this newspaper publication of the scandal uses a photograph for the Duke, but then a cartoon of Gloria with the Duke. This was not unusual to have cartoons to depict well-known people. And you have to admit that Kitty does look like the caricature or cartoon. All right, the ad. This ad, a girl for hostess and solo dancer. Really interesting. I found that this ad is reproduced as a newspaper ad for The Delicious Little Devil, at least in a Los Angeles Times ad section. Not the usual ad section for motion pictures, but the general ad section for an issue of May 1919 when the film was released. And it's amongst all the other ads for Bayer aspirin, for girls' summer coats, isn't that an oxymoron? For ammonia, for, it appears to be for dentures, all sorts of things. And there's this little ad, which is exactly reproducing the ad that Kitty sees, but at the end, instead of saying, contact the Peachtree Inn, it says, for further info, see The Delicious Little Devil, Mae Murray. So sweet, hardworking Kitty, sitting on her mother's lap, is going to try to become the girl with the past. So we're back at the Peachtree Inn. And I think this is a kind of in-joke with these applicants. But I also want to tell you about the Howdy Band, which was a actual Los Angeles band. And it's rather unusual in this time period to see a black band in a film. Of course, we've got so many lost films from this period. It's hard to decide what was what in terms of were they prominent or not. But certainly they were prominent in nightclubs and cabarets in the American culture. And it was controversial. It was part of the jazz age. It was that part of it that was often associated with the degradation of women, that they were listening to hot jazz that came from Africa in its origins and wasn't that horrible. But the joke, I think, is going on here with this lineup of applicants for the job is the contrast between a former Ziegfeld girl like Mae Murray, who was a dancer and a small person, with these tall, model-like showgirls. That was what Ziegfeld was often associated with in terms of his glorification of the American girl, that he combined the model, the clothes model, with the showgirl image, and that he did that most particularly through his emphasis in what was known as the A-Team, which was the group of women that were selected for the Follies, which wore these incredibly elegant and haute couture gowns and were tall and thin and of course white, and sort of presented a haughty attitude, often walking down the runway but not smiling until the very end. So they were tall clothes models, really. And that this even got emphasized more after 1915 for reasons I won't go into. But so Mae Murray was the opposite of that, in being the dancer who was slight. When these dancers were actually anonymous women in the chorus, they were called ponies or chickens. But of course, Mae Murray had gone beyond that anonymity to become a star of the Follies. But I think there's still a joke going on here in terms of her overcoming the A-Team, as it were. And here's the last of the A-Team. Asserting her superiority over this little ill-dressed person. But then the last of the A-Team becomes the means through which Kitty gets out on the floor. Albeit on her behind. She gets her chance for the audition. Now, I should mention the McVeigh band that supports Mae in this dance scene was a Los Angeles band that was quite pioneering and did a lot of work in terms of the movie industry, playing on the silent film sets as well as playing at star parties. And the leader of the band, Isaac, nicknamed Satchel McVeigh, also had an early radio program in the 1920s. I like the way this dance scene with Mae Murray takes a while to wind up and shows this rapport between her and the band. But she's also obviously starting to have a good time after her warm-up. And she's even gotten Mr. Musk and Larry into the rhythm. So it's been a successful audition. And she certainly doesn't dance the way one might expect Gloria to dance. In fact, she's pretty terrible. So one wonders whether Larry knows what he's doing. But nevertheless, she's trying everything she knows. She's still trying everything, pulling out all the stops. There's a certain charm about it. The good girl who becomes a dancer. How is she going to stay good in this atmosphere of alcohol, black jazz, and the cabaret scene that would attract playboys as well as your tired businessmen? then she has to prove she's Gloria, and she whips out the newspaper with the cartoon depicting her and the Duke. Now, this cartoon actually does resemble Mae Murray as she appeared in a lot of her star photos and more into the 20s. I mean, when her hair got blonder. So it's kind of interesting whether or not audiences would buy this in terms of what they knew Mae Murray looked like when she was glamorous, or as she could look like, because she doesn't really look that much like Kitty at this moment. And her explanation of her brogue is pretty thin, of course, but funny. Change of identities, that was part of the appeal of post-World War I consumerism for women, and their gobbling up of fan magazines and their admiration for stars like Mae Murray and their attempt to imitate them. Mae Murray was known as the girl with the bee-stung lips. And so bee-stung lips became a fad amongst young women. And dancing was hugely popular. Not only cabaret dancing, but also more artistic dancing, ballroom dancing, exhibition dancing. It was part of a culture that was associated with women, sometimes negatively, as with the tango tease that Valentino was associated with as his starting out as a lounge lizard in New York. Speaking of lounge lizards, now we're introduced to the Duc de Sauternes, played by Bertram Raspey. So, the tired old Peachtree Inn has become a cabaret with hot jazz and a new star, a new dance star, the glittering, the gorgeous Gloria. I wonder if this is a play on Gloria Swanson. In any case, this scene combines two things of the age. The cultural obsession with Orientalism as a style, as a decor, as a fantasy of sexual transgression. And it also is dealing with the cabaret, which is soon going to be a thing of the past in terms of its success, because the Volstead Act, prohibition, is just about around the corner. It's 1919, and in 1920, it's going to be passed and become the law of the land. No alcohol. So the cabaret, however, in the teens, before the Volstead Act was passed, was a radical phenomenon, says dance historian Louis Ehrenberg, who I think is terrific on this subject. And he says it was so radical because it brought a kind of newness to the interaction, the public interaction of men and women. And he says that it offered adventure and risk and what he calls, quote, the public displays of private impulses, quote, in the teens, and expressiveness particularly through dance, in the dancing couples. Also through the seating, in the close seating, the possibility for flirtation, the movable chairs, which we're going to see demonstrated, the intimacy around tables with men and women mixing together, the possibility of the loosening effects of alcohol, the dancing, the smoking, the socializing. So as he calls it, a faster, more risk-oriented environment for well-to-do people in semi-darkness, so that the patrons of the cabaret could have risk, could have adventure, particularly in the sexual realm. They could enjoy themselves, they could relax, they could experiment, they could move about at ease. But there was some control over it. There was some protection to them and to their reputations, and particularly protections for women. So there was some maintenance of the conventional in terms of sexual and social order at the same time that it was playing with the transgressive. And as he says, this was very important for the class of people that it addressed. I'm going to go back to that, but let's see Gloria / Kitty's entrance. So she's got the spotlight. She's dressed in her oriental outfit and she's emulating a peacock. Mae Murray would actually make a film called Peacock Alley. She would make it in 1922, and then she would come back and make it as a sound picture. The 22 version was one of her most successful films. So this is a kind of artsy dance in some ways. Where's the naughtiness? Maybe in the costume, I don't know. It's a little eccentric. And you can see that she's close to her audience. So one of the appeals of the cabaret, beyond the drinking and dancing atmosphere with a certain social safety net included, was that the audience could interact with the performer, that was not out of the question. And Mae Murray was known for some strenuous moves in her dancing. So this cabaret scene was generally part of the new urban culture, even though in this film it's depicted as being in this, I don't know what, suburban roadhouse, transformed suburban roadhouse. So the prosperous patrons of a cabaret would attract people like Jimmy Calhoun, aka Rudolph Valentino. And he would be someone who would be attractive, what shall we say, that he would be attractive for the dancer as gold digger, the not good woman, to try to snare. In other words, for the lower class woman, even though she's in this spectacularized, eroticized even more via Orientalism, and the idea that the Orient was a place where almost anything could happen sexually, the professional dancer would have access to upper class men and could attract those men and maybe even marry them. And in fact, Mae Murray's first husband was the son of a millionaire. His name was William Schwenker, and his father was in the business of providing supplies to the makers of beer. There's another industry that no doubt went out with the Volstead Act. And so he was smitten with Mae Murray, and they married. He threw her this lavish breakfast at a rather famous New York restaurant and presumed his father would pay for it. And then the father basically cut him off completely because he had married this dancer. So he ended up in court for non-payment of his debts, and May was supporting him, just like Kitty in this film supports her family members. Millionaire Jr. ultimately got a job as a chauffeur, but it didn't last very long, and she just had enough, so she divorced him. And then later on in some of her publicity actually talked about how dancers, chorus girls, even stars of the Follies should never get involved with the sons of millionaires, particularly if those millionaires were, as she said, tightwads. So dancing women, both professionals and amateurs, were seen as embodying a kind of new womanhood. They were young, they were attractive, they expressed bodily freedom. People like Irene Castle actually promoted dancing as healthful, that it was exercise. And this was a new appeal in terms of constructing a new aspect of womanhood. In some respects, someone like Irene Castle could merge the virgin and the vamp, that they were attractive to men, but of course, Irene married Vernon. They were models for young women to emulate, but they were also associated with some rather questionable dance movements like the tango, which was considered to be something that had to be danced way too close in terms of hip contact. So there was a liberation to the image of the dancer in terms of social relations, in terms of physicality, a kind of rebellion implicit in the dancer against previous older sexual mores. But the prosperous patrons of the cabaret could be dangerous to dancers. But in the cabaret, young people could avoid the watchfulness of parents. So it was a whole different thing than the previous private dances. And one wonders in this context too, whether notoriety and publicity is an attraction to people who went to the cabarets. The idea that the young millionaire or millionaire's boy can be interested in a woman with a rather sullied, sexually sullied reputation. So now we have a return to the character played by Ivor McFadden. So I want to say a little bit about him. He apparently was in 11 silent feature films in the decade between 1916 and 1927. He was born in San Francisco, and he didn't really make many films. In part, people think because he attempted to be a producer. Nevertheless, I only found one film listed produced by him in 1922, and that was called In Another Man's Boots, under the Ivor McFadden Productions. He also was in some short films, two-reelers, 22-minute films. He was in shorts in the sound period as well. He was in some Three Stooges shorts. So he basically sort of went downhill from being a supporting player, as he is in this film, to being an extra. And he was an extra in John Ford's famous film of 1939, Young Mr. Lincoln. He died in August of 1942 at the age of 55. So let's turn for a moment to something that I should have talked about earlier, because it is actually quite good in this film, and I think is so in this scene as well, and that's the cinematography. So the cinematographer for this film was Alan Ziegler, and his best work, sort of like Ivor McFadden, or his most proclaimed work, was in the silent era. In the sound era, he was mainly confined to shooting B films and serials. But in the silent era, he not only worked on 7 films with director Robert Z. Leonard, who, as I mentioned earlier, directed this film, and that included 5 films with Mae Murray, but he also made 7 films with a fantastic husband-wife team at Universal, director and screenwriter, and who did what has become a matter of some controversy, with most people thinking that the most talented member of this duo was the wife, Lois Weber, and her husband was Philip Smalley. The films they made that Ziegler worked on as cinematographer included The Dumb Girl of Portici from 1916, which had the ballet dancer Anna Pavlova as the star, a fantastic film from that same year called Shoes, which has parallels to The Delicious Little Devil, except that it's a drama, and it's a drama in which a young working girl has to support her family because her father is basically lazy. She ultimately gives herself to a man, has sex with a man in order to get the pair of shoes that she needs to keep working. It's just a devastating film. He also shot the famous Lois Weber directed film, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, and amongst his other Weber films were The Idle Wives and The Price of a Good Time. So these were films that were very engaged with social problems of the times, particularly those that were focused on women. So he shot those films, and he shot the Robert Z. Leonard films, and so that was the highlight of his career. So the films that he shot that had Mae Murray in them were this one, Dangerous Go Slow, Modern Love, The Scarlet Shadow, and What Am I Bid? He also shot 2 films with Robert Z. Leonard at the helm that had former Folly star Marion Davies, and those were April Folly and The Restless Sex. He also shot 1 film for the legendary Todd Browning in 1919, this same year, called The Unpainted Woman, and shot a John Stahl melodrama of 1923 with Louis Stone called The Dangerous Age. So that was quite a record for the silent period for this cinematographer, Alan Siegel. In all, he shot over 200 films in his career, and he also did some work in television as well. Something else we need to talk about before we get any further in this film are the writers. The writers of this film were Harvey F. Thew, T-H-E-W, and John B. Clymer, supposedly based on their short story, Kitty, Mind Your Feet. Now, the screenplay of this film was actually praised by the reviewer in the Motion Picture News, who said, quote, "They have done a fine job." He also said, and some of you may not believe this when you hear it, the reviewer said that, quote, "The plot has a refreshing originality, an originality which, by the way, is a wonderful basis for unusual advertising. It carries through swiftly, is filled with interesting incident, and the comedy situations are scattered generously," end quote. One thing is for certain, stories in the teens and the 20s on screen about millionaires and millionaire sons who were playboys, they are dozens a year of these films. This film, however, does give a cute little turn, I think, to a situation which, of course, resembles in an eerie way Mae Murray's own experience with William Schfinker. Jimmy Calhoun and his father are having the serious talk about Jimmy's interests in Gloria And I love the father's line in this film about cabaret dancers and millionaire sons. And I love the sense that Jimmy is so naive as to think it matters that Gloria is a star of the cabaret. I just think that is a really nice and cynical addition. Valentino really underplays this scene. In fact, you could argue that he underplays in this whole film, but he still manages to seem intense in the cabaret scenes where he's staring with adoration at Gloria. He's very restrained. He's really good in a pretty thankless role. And of course, he's very pretty as always. And as a former dancer, he's got wonderful grace. The way Valentino moves on screen is really unique for the period, and maybe unique ever in the history of cinema. He was just a natural in terms of his refined movement. He lives in his body, which I think makes this final little payoff of this scene with his father, where he walks out the door and the secretary is in the foreground, noticing his departure just as she had noticed his arrival. I think it deserves some comparison to that famous scene in Birth of a Nation, when Lillian Gish is looked at by the soldier in the hospital as a wordless commentary on yearning and someone's attractiveness. The father, of course, is starting his machinations to prevent his son from getting ensnared with a woman who obviously is a gold digger. So this is going to be the motivation for the final scene at the Peachtree Inn. So finally, we have the Duke coming into the picture. He seemed to have fled France a long time ago. A lot has happened. So the Duke is played by Bertram Graspy, who is an English actor and who was very prolific in American film between 1914 and the coming of the talkies in 1927. He usually had several roles a year, 3, 4, 5. He often played dukes, he often played princes, generals. He was often in costume films. He often played exotics from the East and Far East. One thing that is always pointed out about him is that he was one of the actors to play the role of Michael Leonard, the lone wolf, in that detective series. Now we're going to view the scene that was the most controversial in the film. And you're probably going to laugh. It's this Oriental bathing scene in which May is in the bathtub with her servant, who used to be the cleaning lady, attending her in Orientalist fashion. Reviewers ridiculed this scene like no other in the film. Moving Pictures said that this Oriental swimming pool is dragged in by the heels. And then, of course, we see May crawling out of the swimming pool, apparently nude, and that was offensive to some of the reviewers as well. Mae Murray's costumes in this film, or lack of it, as in the scene we just saw, really is an extension of what the Ziegfeld Follies did, in which they were using not only small costumes, which are referred to, or flimsy costumes, which are referred to in many of the reviews of this film, but also lighting in which you could see through some of these diaphanous gowns and costumes, which of course we've already seen in an earlier situation when she's in the cabaret and Kitty then is told to get on her vamping gown by McKean when she goes down to see Rudolph Valentino, aka Jimmy. Another reviewer said of this film, and this is a woman reviewer because it's under the title of The Skirt Says, speaking of women mostly, by The Skirt, and it's in Variety of April of 1919, says of this film that in it, Mae Murray, quote, as a cabaret dancer, wears as few clothes as the law allows or permits. In a peacock dance, a daring costume of sequins barely covered the figure, and when told to don an evening gown to join a party at the table, Miss Murray wore a crystal robe with no lining. They also talk about the, quote, old sensationalism of emerging from a bath stark naked, end quote. So you just saw the moment that was the most controversial in this entire film. But again, not only has precedent in the Ziegfeld Follies, but the bathtub was a signature of Cecil B. DeMille sex dramas of the late teens, some starring Gloria Swanson. Now we get to the dinner that the father of Jimmy has set up in order to disillusion his son and show him that Gloria is just a gold digger. But we have the surprise, or is it, of Kitty's male family members coming to the inn, greeted by a very drunk Mr. Musk. I do find Mr. Musk funny in this scene. He is very, very drunk. I should remark too that before we get away from the topic of Orientalism and costuming, that most of the ads for this film, all of them in fact, that I can find, except for the ones that showed Mae Murray in a kind of portraiture close-up shot, all of them show her in the actual costume she wore in the film that were Orientalists. And there's one ad that actually turns her into a kind of Theda Bara. There is another one of them that actually took advantage of the scene that several critics thought too daring or too old or just indulgent with the bathtub. Though they don't show her going in or out, they just show her lounging beside the bathtub and being fanned by her, quote, Nubian slave. Now we have the return of the McVeigh Band, and you may find it odd that there's guitar playing and slide guitars, but don't forget that in the late teens and the early 20s, there was a fad for Hawaiian-influenced music and a fad for ukulele playing as well. Anything goes. So the Duke has shown up, and now Larry is trying to find a way how to exploit it, of course. That's what he does. That's his business. Cabarets were expected to have seating for real dining, and many of them had these rooms for private parties. you can see the high-class clientele that is eating in that outer restaurant area. You may have wondered who that ancient bellboy is and why he is following the Duke, or maybe you've already figured that out. He's not who he seems to be. I think the cinematography is good, actually, and it's part of what keeps this film going. They could never get Mae Murray's eyebrows right in many a film, as reviewers pointed out. And then she's going to do some mugging in this scene that all of us could do without. It's a very nice set, too. Graspy as the Duke is good in this role. In the sense that he's already giving out menace very quietly. Elegant menace. This is not one of Mae's best moments in this film. But that's not her forte. This kind of emotional moment is not really Mae Murray's forte. Comedy is more her forte. And I think this scene goes on too long, actually, as well. Because we cannot imagine that Jimmy is going to give her up, or that the Duke is going to manage to seduce her. We know that's not going to happen. Not in a film that's called The Delicious Little Devil. That's got to be a comedy. And the audience would have known from all the advertising it was going to be a comedy. Robert Z. Leonard, Mae Murray's husband until 1925, and the director of this film, does know how to direct a film. And he certainly kept doing it for years and years and years. Settling in at MGM in the 30s and the 40s, which meant that he had a very long career, since he started with Selig Studio, which was one of the earliest studios to set up headquarters in Southern California. And he started out as an actor, a writer, and a director. He was even the Scarecrow in a 1910 one-reel version of The Wizard of Oz. At MGM in the 30s and the 40s, and I guess the 50s too, he kept directing for a long time. He directed a lot of their most profitable and prestigious female stars, including Greta Garbo, Ginger Rogers, Myrna Loy, Joan Crawford, Constance Bennett, Greer Garson, Judy Garland, and Lana Turner, and Norma Shearer, who of course was married to production head Irving Thalberg. Some people have called him one of American film's most prolific directors, but in Andrew Sarris's Directors and Directions from the 1960s, in which he outlined what made a really great director, There is no listing for Robert Z. Leonard at all. We can only assume that Saris regarded him as a studio hack. But I think what you can see from this film, he is certainly not a hack. I find this opening of this scene very amusing. Maybe it's a good argument for prohibition. Soon enough. Even Mr. Musk has had enough. And there's the antique bellboy again. The two who are cold stone sober are the rivals. Mr. Calhoun and the good girl, Kitty/Gloria. Though it looks as though the Duke may be only pretending to be asleep, and indeed that is the case. Here's a shot in which you can actually tell how diaphanous her gown is. So even though the shape of it might be similar to what Mary Pickford would wear, Mary Pickford would not choose a see-through dress. But Mae Murray was a creature from Broadway. She was a Ziegfeld girl, and here she goes into the overactive thyroid acting. While Valentino still is putting a cap on it. No histrionics. And the Duke turns into an old-time villain, the rapist. Will her male relatives be better at saving her from assault than they are at earning a living? Not really. Very passive. Only through their bulk and luck does she get away. It's an amazing fall. We don't know how he survived it in such fine shape. Valentino was not a big man. He was about 5'8", according to most reports. But he was quite athletic. And now we have a car chase. I'm not sure why we need a car chase. It's not a badly done car chase. And the environs are pretty interesting. Probably the Hollywood Hills. Towards the end of Sunset in the old days. To believe that Southern California looked like this only about 100 years ago. Now we have to wait through this. You cannot leave the film now because Ivor McFadden delivers a line that you have to hear. And of course, I could tell you what happened to Mae Murray after this film, and into the 30s. She basically married as her fourth husband a man who was a pretend prince, and he got all her money away from her, and she had a considerable amount, not only all the money she made as a star, as a top star, but she also found oil on some of her property. Yes, she married him in 26. Valentino was at the wedding. And by 1931, she knew it had been a very big mistake. So by the end of her life, she was living in poverty. She lost the son she had by him to another family. Most people thought she was out of her mind because she lived in a kind of fantasy land in which she said she was still a star. And she was. But her philosophy all along had been to live with optimism and belief in something other than reality, so it wasn't too far stretched to see her go in that direction. Another star of that era who also fell on hard times and who was also a dancer, Louise Brooks, commented to John Coble, famous for his photographic collection of stars, among other things, said of May, "She was the most ridiculous woman and a most ridiculous actress, and let us say insane, in a way. On the other hand, she was a great success, and anyone who made a success in the business has something. Believe me, it is the roughest, toughest, most humiliating and degrading job in the world. So they will not allow her to be even barely good, let's say in The Merry Widow. It was the best performance she ever gave. And it is cruel when she was an old woman not to give her credit for what she had. A lovely body, a certain kind of grace, a silly kind of personality. The fact is, her pictures kept old man Mayer, that's Louis B. Mayer, who she worked for in the 20s, going at Metro for a long time. So she must have had something, for in the end, it is the public that matters with films." End quote from Louise Brooks. But as Brooks said, it's the public that counts. And for over 10 years, the public loved Mae Murray. in spite of her eccentricities, in spite of whatever her weaknesses of acting might have been. And they and we might declare, like Ivor McFadden does as Denny at the end of The Delicious Little Devil, God, how I loved that girl. This is Galen Stuhler signing off. Thank you for listening to my commentary, and I hope you enjoyed The Delicious Little Devil, starring Mae Murray